Michael Carrick continues to enhance his growing reputation in Manchester, and Bruno Fernandes once more emphasises his importance to his team. It's fair to say the prospect of a return to Champions League football is building weekly. Who knows what this group is capable of under this new look coaching team? We are covering every bit of it and more ahead of the weekend arrival of Spurs. It's not a bad time to be a Red. The weeks are flying by far too quickly, folks. How in the name of God is it February already? And how are you all doing on this miserable, wet and rainy Tuesday as Manchester United made it 9 from 9 under the watchful eye of Michael Carrick and Steve Holland? Now, there is so much to unpack today, with everything from another starring show from Casemiro to the majesty of Bruno and the game-winning antics of a very deserving Benjamin Sesko. Alongside me today to chat about all is a man who, like myself, is regularly amongst it all on the ground, but he is plying his trade with Sky Sports as a Manchester United reporter who has seen his fair share, is Mr. Danyal Khan. We've spoken quite a bit away from here, so it was only fitting that we had a nice chat for all to hear. How's everything with you, sir?
All good, Shaun. Thank you so much for having me on. Just coming fresh off deadline day, which was uneventful, but there was still a few tales at Carrington, which was enough to keep me going. But it was actually nice for once that deadline day wasn't dominated by Manchester United or anyone else. All the news was elsewhere. So I had a pretty chill day at Carrington throughout the day. So it could be worse.
It was a bit strange, wasn't it? Because it is normally Manchester United dominated to as much as we can possibly imagine. But I'm sure there's a lot of people listening now that have spent years looking at deadline day. Can you give some bit of an insight into what an average deadline day looks like for you?
Honestly, it's changed so much over the years, of course. I think anyone who watches, say, Sky Sports News can tell that. Obviously, in January especially, you think maybe with the financial rules that has kind of limited the amount of transfers that maybe now happen in January. But before I started covering Manchester United, I used to cover the Midlands, actually, and a lot of Wolves on deadline day. And they were notorious for a deadline day signing, as they did this week as well, with a former United graduate, Angel Gomez. But I think it's interesting because United in the summer obviously got Sonny Lomans, and that was obviously very eventful, and actually we probably don't appreciate how well the club did to bring him in now, in hindsight. But you think over the years, United have signed some interesting players around deadline day. You think Odi and Igalo, for example. I remember that day, thinking, United were never going to do any business. And all of a sudden he's flying over to Manchester with a massive smile on his face. And you kind of thought, is there a chance that could happen this week, on deadline day? Would there maybe be a midfielder potentially coming in? But, on reflection, you feel like United probably did the right thing in terms of keeping their powder dry and perhaps now looking forward to the summer.
Well, that's it. Every indication that I've been given for many months and what's been widely reported is that there's a very, very ambitious summer planned. And with the expected outgoings from Manchester, midfield is going to be very heavily inundated. And I think you might be a little bit more busier when it comes that time. Today, we witnessed so much coming and going from Old Trafford in the weekly, especially with the latest trauma coming with Ruben Amorim's departure. A man that you obviously had the pleasure of sitting down speaking with during his time in the Northwest. I had time speaking with him when he was actually in Portugal. Despite the growing impatience around the football club, as was demonstrated by the 1958 planned protest before the game at the weekend, the decision to appoint Carrick was viewed as an unknown variable, adding maybe further ammunition to those who suggested that this Ineos hierarchy was acting without a clear and a concise plan. Now, you fast forward 3 weeks, the man has spearheaded nothing short of a revolution with 3 impressive wins, all displaying a variety of different characteristics from this squad, whether it was the dominance displayed during the Manchester derby, the ability to inflict such damage in Arsenal's backyard when they were on such a high, down to the ebbs and flows that we witnessed against a very dogged Fulham side that maybe were not given the credit that they deserved coming into the game. Nobody can disregard the heart and the character that we are seeing under this new look coaching team. How did you view the team dynamic during Sunday's 3-2 win against Fulham then?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Sean. And to be honest, I was very interested to see how the team were going to respond just under Michael Carrick generally, because the two games in charge under Darren Fletcher, I think you could tell there were some growing pains from a team that had been so rehearsed in terms of slow build-up play under Ruben Amorim, kind of being coached every single move of how to attack, for example. I think you saw under Darren Fletcher for those two games that they struggled to maybe be free. They were still stuck in a middle place of maybe what Amram was trying to coach them and Fletcher trying to tell them to be more free. Now, I think what impressed me the most about the Fulham game, you look at the one-off tactics against Manchester City, Arsenal, you obviously praise the team, praise Michael Carrick and his backroom staff, but Fulham always felt the big one, didn't it? In terms of them struggling against teams. Michael Carrick even acknowledged it when I asked him about it in his pre-match news conference that there are a lot of questions around this team facing a lower block. And what I was very surprised about was the ambition of the team, the angles of the passing that Casemiro, Kobe Mainoo were finding, the wingers and the attackers, the little flicks and tricks that these players were trying to display. Okay, maybe not all of them paid off, but they just simply weren't doing that under Ruben Amorim. And I think it's very cliche for managers and coaches to say, I want my team to play free. I want them to play, have fun on the pitch, all these cliches we hear a lot of the time. But Carrick and his staff have done that while also getting the work rate from the team, while getting kind of them to be accurate in terms of their taking of opportunities, which again, they weren't doing under Amorim. So like his backroom staff and Carrick deserve a lot of credit because they were doing things against Fulham they simply weren't showing earlier in the season under Amorim.
It's impossible to ignore it. And it's something that I have written about in great detail. It's something I discussed with several individuals over the last few weeks, even on this podcast, just about how it's almost restoring the fundamentals within the football team. And something I said, it was I think it was with Phil Brown last week. I lost track throughout the many months, not only just Amram, but anyone beforehand, just how many times professional footballers could misplace the most simplistic of passes. You're looking at them and thinking, this is Sunday league level stuff that we're seeing here. And you're playing for Manchester United. Yet Carrick has come in and alongside Steve Holland, who I think deserves all the credit in the world for what he's doing behind the scenes. They have the players just focusing on completing the fundamentals to the very best of their ability. And then thereafter, what you see is the natural class, the flair, the tenacity, the technical ability that actually brought them to Manchester United shine through. There were so many individual cameos that are worth dissecting from that game. I have to start with the man that so many people just seem hell-bent on belittling at every given opportunity. Bruno Fernandes has already contributed 5 goals and 12 assists in 21 Premier League appearances this season. He needs 9 more assists from 14 fixtures to break the league record, currently sitting at 20. And he was once again utterly integral for United again at the weekend. With so much speculation, as we referenced about the summer, and the fact that midfield will be the most crucial area to be addressed during that window, do you think the club should be prioritising retaining their captain for years to come, Dan?
It's a very interesting situation. I think it's something that isn't going to go away anytime soon. I mean, just touching on his performance against Fulham, what I just think he hasn't got enough credit that I've seen in the media coverage since that win is in the 95th minute, the audacity to, do the feint that beats Calvin Bassey, who's just come on, by the way, as a substitute, who's physically bigger than him, who is younger than him. If that doesn't work, can you imagine the criticism Bruno Fernandes gets and the referee blows the whistle and everyone's going, what is he doing? To beat someone like Bassey and then while falling, get that cross in for Šeško. And by the way, it is perfection because that cross, I know people might think, he's just put it in, but he's put it onto Šeško's back foot, which actually gives him the space to get the shot away. If that's on his front foot in front of Šeško, it gets blocked. And these little things just show you the quality he has. Now, his future, Sean, you mentioned that. It is incredibly interesting. I think if Amorim's still in charge and he's playing as a 6 still with Bruno Fernandes, perhaps you do entertain offers in the summer and think, actually, do they need an upgrade in that position? Now, he's playing as a 10 again, and as we all know, he is one of the best creative players, if not the most creative player in the Premier League in that position. And then there's a wider discussion. What does Bruno Fernandes want? I mean, he's told us in the media, hasn't he, that he'll discuss his future after the World Cup. Now, does it depend how the World Cup goes with Portugal? That will, I'm sure, have a factor in his own decision. But I think from a Manchester United point of view, the numbers you mentioned, the contributions he's, contributing in this United team, in this position, I think he's invaluable. And I really think now, I think it's a different conversation when he was a six under Amorim, because you probably think the legs in that two in midfield wasn't enough, really, when it was Casemiro and Fernandes. Whereas now you think it doesn't matter how much money you get offered it for Bruno Fernandes. You can't replace that quality that we've just discussed that gets you the win against teams like Fulham.
I'm glad you said that, because ultimately, if he was to go and you get this large influx of cash, you have to recruit a replacement. Even if they looked at, maybe we don't need an immediate replacement because we can work with Cunha and Mbeumo. Both of those players, amazing talents. Obviously, we've seen that maybe Mbeumo hit the ground running a little bit quicker than Cunha, but Cunha has now caught up with him, and the two of them, such integral facets of this attacking trio. But they don't have the creativity that Bruno has. And when you're looking at a player at 31 closing in on 32, it's not the same as it was 10, 15 years ago, because he has the capacity to continue playing at this level, delivering that output for the next 2, 3, 4 seasons easy. It's kind of that Ryan Giggs template where he's taken care of himself so much. He hasn't endured injuries like a footballer should be enduring at this stage of his career. It's so minute, the amount of games that he's actually missed. When you speak about him being invaluable, I can't think of another footballer that I would prefer to have in the team in that creative capacity than Bruno Fernandes. I can't think of a team in European football that he wouldn't walk into immediately. But one man who certainly won't be staying at the club beyond this season is Casemiro. And I think that is a slightly different conversation, because you're looking at two different dynamics and two different workloads on the field. Bruno naturally likes to get around the field. He naturally likes to be involved in as much as he can. And he seems to have this freakish engine. Whereas in Casemiro, maybe you saw the undeniable perils of age when he was playing that midfield two alongside Bruno Fernandes, because he had to do so much covering work that Bruno cannot do in that sixth position. And at 33, soon to be 34, it's an entirely different dynamic, especially when you're factoring in the salary, because it's so big. Even though we know that he's going to be departing, he added to his growing portfolio of superb individual displays, even at 33 years of age. He's notched another trademark header, which so many people forget was his 5th goal of the league campaign, which is just staggering. And when you have Jamie Carragher correcting his nonsensical statement about the Brazilian, and even your colleague Rob Dorset referencing what so many people are speaking about in the hopes of a U-turn from the club, it's safe to say one of this generation's finest midfielders still has plenty to offer this season. And I think it's also worthwhile noting that the man Carragher shared such a skewed opinion previously. He has as many goal contributions as Florian Wirtz does at Liverpool, and people are very, very quick to hide that one. Just how impressive has Casemiro been at the heart of this midfield, and how crucial is his presence for the remainder of the season for the overall benefit and development of Kobbie Mainoo?
Yeah, I mean, Shaun, you're right to compare, say, Bruno Fernandes and Casemiro in the squad. I think, not to compare the blue half to the red half of Manchester, but you look at Bruno Fernandes similar to Kevin De Bruyne and how City have actually struggled to replace Kevin De Bruyne's creativity, and you look at how many players they've brought in those positions. There's not a like for like to replace players like a Kevin De Bruyne, like a Bruno Fernandes. You just simply can't, you can spend millions upon millions, and it is so difficult. Whereas you look at Casemiro, and look, I'm not backing Jamie Carragher because he's my colleague at Sky, but maybe he would regret the extremity of what he said about the football leaving him at that point in time. But you also do have to say Casemiro's career at Manchester United has been a bit of a roller coaster. Of course, that first season when he was brought in, and again, you have to give it context, right? He was essentially a panic buyer. I remember under Eric Ten Hag, when United had a pretty devastating loss away to Brentford, when Brentford put 4 past United. I mean, Eric Ten Hag went to the board and said, I want a midfielder. We need a midfielder. They went to get Casemiro. Obviously, he has enjoyed his time in the club. He's bought in to the club, the culture. He's been a fantastic player to have in that changing room. But halfway through his career, I mean, look, Ruben Amorim got a lot wrong, but I think even he acknowledged that Casemiro, for whatever reasons, wasn't at a physically competitive level for whatever reason to play in the Premier League. Now, look, the system didn't help him. Like you said, he was exposed in the midfield. The amount of counter-attacks that was facing him towards the end of Eric Ten Hag's era and the beginning and middle of Ruben Amorim, look, it didn't help him whatsoever. But you could tell just by his body composition, he clearly went away, as Amorim mentioned quite a few times. He went away and worked on himself. You look at him this season, I mean, he's come back lean, he's come back fit to with a point to prove, right? And so you have to admire what he's done to get back into the United team. And look, I think his decision to leave the club and United's decision not to renew his contract, they need more legs in midfield, don't they? And with the wages he's on, he's one of the highest earners. It will give them room in the summer when you have the likes of what we think Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, Casemiro, potentially Harry Maguire off the wages. That is going to give you room to bring in younger players, on longer term contracts, on lesser wages, that you hope will grow with this United team, for years to come. And that is what the strategy has to be, because you look at Chelsea, you look at Liverpool, you look at Manchester City, they all now have teams ready to compete over that period of time. And that is what United have to get to. The only thing to answer your question, Shaun, about how important is he? I mean, we've seen that throughout the season, haven't we? Every time he goes off the pitch, United concede goals, and that happened against Fulham again. And look, I think United made the right decision in January not to sign any emergency or panic kind of signings to cover them for 6 months. But you do have to acknowledge they are short in that area. And if Casemiro was to get an injury, or Kobbie Mainoo was to get an injury, they are short in that area. And that is a fact. And I think everyone in Carrington will acknowledge that as well.
Absolutely. And especially this morning when you see even Sekou Kone has gone out on loan for the remainder of the season, that's another potential avenue that could have been brought in, a break in case of emergency situation. The only thing I think that we're witnessing, maybe there has been a calculated roll of the dice here. Had there to have been participation in domestic cups, even Europe, we might have seen a slightly different situation. The likes of Ruben Neves has been mentioned quite a bit over the last couple of weeks as well. We know that the ideals from this hierarchy is to focus on Project 150. In doing so, last summer we saw the massive focus on attack with the trio of players coming in. And that's why it's then going to shift to midfield next summer, because there's a calculated approach to what the club is trying to achieve. It's meticulously putting these pieces together, as Phil said last week, putting square pegs in square holes. We've mentioned all of the necessary clusters of this team, and I've just focused on the attack. That attack has obviously flourished in recent weeks. It's only been bolstered by the strength and depth that we are seeing between starters and those on the bench. It offers such a contrast to the midfield. I had compiled a really detailed piece on this yesterday or the day before, highlighting the return of 8 goals from 11 big chances created during Carrick's tenure. That's a tremendous return. One thing that we haven't mentioned so far in this conversation is the defence has also impressed, largely through Harry Maguire and Lisandro Martinez. Now, although 4 goals have been conceded, this came from a total of only 3 big chances against from the last 3 fixtures. So that emphasises both the defensive assurance from central defence in Casemiro and Kobbie Mainoo, but also the importance of a fit again Martinez. Now, before I continue, don't get me wrong here. Harry has been immense, and his contractual status, just as we've spoken about with Bruno and Casemiro, that's going to be a very interesting point of conversation. But with Martinez acting as a quarterback of sorts, that's kind of how I've penned this over the previous couple of months, alongside his vastly underrated defensive skill set, we're now seeing so many of the benefits that Amorim lost out on during his spell on the sidelines when he was having surgery and rehabilitation. And then Licha spoke last week, and he offered this public admiration of Carrick, suggesting that he has touched his heart. Now, I don't think you'll ever get a finer compliment from a Premier League footballer than that. But when we speak about the importance of Bruno and Casemiro during this run, just how crucial has Martinez been, and more importantly, how integral is he going to be in moving forward?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point out the defence, Shaun. And I mean, you look at Fulham, right? I mean, one was a penalty and one was an absolute worldie by Kevin in terms of what they conceded, right? And you of course can't use that as an excuse every game if that continues, and so they keep giving those type of goals away. But it did feel like, the last few games, United have been really comfortable. And I think we'll talk about Lissandra in a second, but I think the big difference I've seen under Michael Carrick is just the gaps between the midfield and the defence and the attack, but especially the midfield and defence is so much tighter. The players are defending the box. I mean, Ruben Amorim used to mention it quite often, but it never improved, was their actual box defending on the edge of their box. They're getting challenges in, but it feels like the gaps that the spaces they need to chase down are much, much tighter between those two departments. And I think that's been a big help. Talking about Lisandro Martinez, though, I mean, he is fundamentally one of the best centre-backs in the Premier League. I have no qualms with saying that. And, Paul Scholes, Nicky Butt can mention his size. I mean, I just don't get it, really. He showed against Raul Jimenez, one of the most experienced, a very good Premier League striker with his size, that he had no issues defending against him. And he's excellent with his feet. What I love about him is when he marauds with the ball in attacking positions, just with his eyes as well as his foot movement, he opens spaces because the opposition are trying to guess where he's going with it. And he did that a few times against Fulham. And that's what he offers. And look, whatever happens with Harry Maguire, what Manchester United know is if Maguire was to leave in the summer, we have two very experienced centre-backs in Lisandro Martinez and Matthias de Ligt. Hopefully Matthias de Ligt is back fit very soon as well. But to help your Aiden Heavens and Lenny Euros come through over the next few years, I mean, Lisandro, from what I know around the club and, hearing from people around the club, he is a huge influence off the pitch as well. I mean, you can imagine what he's like in training, his tenacity and, kind of going all in. But I think that's what they've always needed to show on the pitch. Now he's fit. He brings that extra 2%, 3%. And hopefully, I think for everyone, hopefully he can just stay fit, because we've not seen that long enough in a United shirt.
He's been very unfortunate, hasn't he?
Absolutely, yeah.
I referenced Bruno and his almost freakish nature in staying fit so long. When you actually look back on the injury history of Martinez, he had little to none before coming to Manchester. And then when you look at the nature of the injuries that he's actually picked up, he has just been so unlucky. Yeah. You remember who was it against? Was it against Crystal Palace? Where essentially the player fell on him after a challenge. And then just like that, you're gone for months upon months upon months. But this is something that I have composed multiple times. And I was doing so largely during Amorim's tenure as well. When you look at the tactical fluidity and the structure that Amorim tries to implement in his teams, with his obviously now infamous 3-back, always one of those central defenders would have been that ball carrying forward, the player you've referenced that marauds forward into attacking positions, but is also very, very competent on the football. And when you look at the underlying metrics that Martinez provides to this team, just going against centre-backs in the Premier League, he is second to very few in the context of his distribution, his key passes, his long balls, his ball carrying, his progressive carries, his progressive passes. He is just such an influential character for this team, for the heartbeat of this team. Even when you look at something that's not spoken about very often, but this bond that he has with Mbeumo, that Mbeumo knows when to make a run, and these long lofted balls over the top, they are cutting defences apart at will. I'm glad that you mentioned the growing responsibility that he has around Carrington away from the field, because so many people speak about the leadership that you're going to lose with Casemiro, the potential leadership you could lose if Harry Maguire moves on. Martinez is regarded as one of the most influential characters from what I've been told around Carrington. He's respected by players and coaching staff alike, and just the aura that he brings to that team, I think that's almost as invaluable as what he brings on the football field. But everything that we have discussed, it all plays hand in hand, I think, with what has become one of the most competitive Premier League seasons in recent years. And I say that because I know that some move to criticise the level of competition today that we see. But then when you see 5 of the English sides in the top 8 of the Champions League, with Newcastle still alive, having finished just outside, and then you also factor in Forest, Villa, Palace in the Europa League and below, I think it's now more so a conversation about where football as a whole has transitioned to today. But that said, United are closing the gap on Villa in 3rd. with that now reduced to 5 points. They're only 6 points behind City in second. There is so much conversation about the importance of the next permanent manager or head coach at Old Trafford, with so many eyes on the club's pursuit of what I've stated with Project 150. Now, I've long suggested that if Carrick guides United back to the Champions League, while retaining this brand of football that we are witnessing, while also unifying the bond between supporters and players, I think it's going to be very difficult to remove him. Bearing that in mind, would you think otherwise, or where do you stand on this topic?
It is so interesting, isn't it? Because it's something we will talk about on a weekly basis, isn't it, Shaun? And you can imagine, say they lose 4-0 to Tottenham, on Saturday, all of a sudden it's Michael Carrick shouldn't get the job, So I think we'll have to be aware of the extremities public opinion might sway over the next few months. What I always kind of toy in my head at the moment is, how would we be talking about Michael Carrick if Ole Gunnar Solskjaer never became the permanent manager of Manchester United? Because I think that is what the caveat is around Michael Carrick, which actually perhaps isn't that fair to Carrick himself when we're trying to judge as to whether he should stay on, because it feels like almost everyone has PTSD from even wanting Carrick to continue as head coach, because the argument is, well, look what happened with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. It didn't lead to trophies or success. And is that fair to compare Carrick to someone who, Carrick himself has grown as a coach, as a head coach, in terms of what he's learned at Middlesbrough since? And also, they're two very different people. And also the squad is completely different as well. The Premier League, as you mentioned, has moved on in a few years as well. So that argument in itself, I failed to kind of compare Carrick and rule him out because of that. I think if he leads Manchester United to Champions League football, I think this is where I've kind of come to terms with it, is he should be given an opportunity as equal to everyone else who could be available. So what I mean by that is, maybe Carrick won't buy this, or maybe he won't want to stay this long. But I think, of course, he'll be interviewed essentially as he's managing right now, right? But I think once you know who is available in the summer, the likes of your Thomas Tuchel, whether it's Julian Nagelsmann or whoever else, Mauricio Pochettino, even who we know has been interviewed for the job in the past, I think Carrick deserves an opportunity to be interviewed again alongside all of those coaches, and then you have a decision to make. I mean, it'll be very interesting. I do think it's difficult to not give him the job, but then also I think you need more time to see how these players respond. I mean, I remember at the end of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's interim period when he became head coach, but at the end of that season, the team actually trailed off and failed to pick up wins. And it felt like the kind of great motivation that he came with after the PSG win trailed off a little bit. And I think that's what we need to see from Carrick is, can he maintain the performance levels for the next few months compared to Solskjaer? That's probably the only comparison I would make. But yeah, what about you? Where do you stand?
I think first and foremost, Carrick and this team was given 17 games to come in and try to settle the ship and regain some sort of a foothold in European football. That was the prerogative. Everything that I was told from day one when it came down to conversations with Solskjaer and Carrick was that Solskjaer came in, he had very positive conversations, a very forward-thinking approach about the type of football that he wanted to play. But there was always this underlying message of a real desire to put himself in the conversation to remain permanently. Whereas the conversations that Carrick had when he came in were more so a table that I'm happy to come in and help, I'm going to play attacking football, I'm going to try to reconnect the team and the supporters. And it's not more so important about me stamping my authority on the possibility to be a permanent manager, but that I can enhance my footprint on the game and put myself out there for various other positions that may become available. That was very enticing from what I was told by the board, because they have these aspirations of waiting until the summer and wanting to make the best possible decision they can. Now, when you see Carrick coming in as an ex-player and you have that PTSD that you're talking about that people have with Solskjaer, I do think there's a lot of revisionism there. Solskjaer had back-to-back very impressive league finishes. He was a penalty kick away from winning a European trophy, or De Gea just being incapable of saving a penalty. Realistically, there was massive failings from the sporting department to actually build a proper cohesive team And the less said then about Ronaldo coming back to the club, the better, because that could lead on to an entire podcast in itself. But I do not believe that Carrick should be judged in the same way. I do not think that Carrick's appointment or decision not to appoint him should in any way, shape or form be taken in reflection to what occurred with Solskjaer, because they're totally different dynamics. Is it fair to say that Carrick and Holland should be given an opportunity to continue doing what they're doing if they won 17 games out of 17? No, obviously not. It's absurd. But the point I was making, and from the initial question that I posed to you, was that if we continue to see a brand of football that the supporters can relate to, if we continue to see the players giving their all, as Martinez has obviously openly stated from what I referenced previously, we can all see that the players are giving everything for Carrick and the coaching team. And if ultimately they finish in Champions League, and we can see that there is progression, because this is the thing that I've been stating for years and years. As long as we are seeing perennial progression at this football club, then eventually we will get to a point of perennial competitiveness in all of the competitions. We've been so far from that for so long. And as Solskjaer stated, you can win the odd trophy along the way, but it can mask what is a lack of progression every single year. You're right to say that it tailored off toward the end of Solskjaer's tenure, but I do think there was a lot of mitigating factors in the background that led to that. And I think that this idea that Solskjaer's time at the club wasn't successful, which is laid out by so many people, I think it's false. I think it is the closest that we have come as supporters to being linked with the football team, to understanding what is going on. And that from stand to pitch, there was that 12th man. There was an additional man there to be able to assist. If Carrick can continue doing what he's doing and having these players fight for the badge on a weekly basis, return us to Champions League football, and continue to have the presence and the aura that he's having amongst the dressing room, I would be absolutely dumbfounded if a suit behind the scenes thought this isn't a good idea to keep this one going. I do think it is absolutely pivotal, though, Dan, that Steve Holland is retained regardless of what happens. I know it's normal practice for a new manager or a head coach to come in and to bring their own team. That's obviously to be expected. I don't think there would be anything bad whatsoever about retaining him as kind of a club coach, because what he brings to the overall structure of a dressing room, I think so many people on the outside, they're completely oblivious to just how important he has been here, Dan, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to pick up on a few points. Actually, we'll talk about Steve Holland first. I mean, I know, having been around Carrington a little bit over the last few weeks, the players have been really impressed by Steve Holland, especially, by the whole backroom staff, I think, but especially by Steve Holland. And I think the impression he's made on quite a lot, especially the senior players, of course, like Harry Maguire and Luke Shaw know him from England, Kobe Mainoo as well. I think on the other players, they've been very impressed by his running of the sessions. And it's quite interesting, actually. The kind of Manchester derby, obviously, was this backroom staff's first game in charge, and I was pitch side, actually. And I saw Steve Holland come out of the tunnel, a few hours before kickoff, and he kind of just came out of the tunnel and looked at the stadium, and he kind of looked up and was, just quite. He was taking it in, but you could tell it meant a lot to him as well. And I know kind of Andy Mitten has written in the past that he's a big United fan, or he grew up as a United fan, but you could sense how much it meant to him, to whether it's an interim period or not, how much he enjoys being there. So I think that told a lot as well. I think the interesting thing about Carrick as well, and with Solskjaer, I didn't even mean the end of his kind of third, I suppose, season in charge, where, because as you mentioned, a lot of it was caveated with the they made with Sancho, with Ronaldo, which maybe weren't his signings in particular. What I think I'm more focused on is at the end of his first season, which he was interim and then became permanent. After he became permanent, the performances did tailor off. I know the next year, obviously, they finished second and they picked up again, of course. But you saw that kind of period wear off a little bit. And I think that's the interesting with Carrick and his backroom staff. You don't want it to just be a new manager bounce, is all I would say. Now, in terms of Carrick and his backroom staff being appointed, I mean, we can talk now, Shaun. I mean, we know, being around, that there are pros of getting his appointment done, say, at the end of the season, because what does that mean? Well, it means, your recruitment becomes much more clear. We know, obviously, Christopher Vavell, Jason Wilcox will lead that. But if you know who your head coach is, it's much easier to recruit players. It allows those players to speak to the head coach. Your summer planning, your pre-season, all becomes much more focused and clear as well. So it enables planning to be done. Obviously, with the World Cup on the horizon, if you are looking at Tuchel or, someone like that in a World Cup job, that planning does become a lot more short notice, doesn't it? So there are, aside from the results and whatever Carrick and his backroom staff achieve, there are other pros, and I'm sure they'll be thinking there are other advantages by getting someone in early, well before the World Cup, of course, as well. Now, Steve Holland, I completely agree, should stay because of his experience, because of his know-how working at big clubs with big players. I think it would be a mistake for any head coach who comes in to get rid. I guess the only caveat is if Michael Carrick goes elsewhere. I mean, this weekend they're playing Tottenham, right? If Thomas Frank ends up out of a job at the end of the season, do Tottenham go for Michael Carrick? And does Steve Holland, out of loyalty to Carrick for bringing him along, want to join him? I mean, that's the danger, right? And again, maybe a disadvantage if you don't give Carrick the full-time role. I mean, all of these other intricacies outside of the results and European football are all little things to think about, but that could have a big impact.
All very valid points. And the one thing that I would really emphasize from what you've stated, and I would nail it to the wall in there, I would just hope that all of the business is done early in the summer, so as you can then focus on a proper pre-season with a squad that is entering into this new campaign, that we're not speaking. I mean, I know it'll obviously make your day an awful lot easier on deadline day, but that we're not speaking about what Manchester United can and cannot get done there. You've mentioned Spurs, so that'll bring us to Saturday's early kickoff with a struggling Spurs side who, wouldn't you know it, have collected some momentum in gaining a comeback win against City, or comeback point against City, I should say. Amazingly, they're only 9 points ahead of West Ham in the relegation zone, and they've only collected 10 points from the previous 10 Premier League outings, despite coming fourth in the Champions League groupings. All that said, United have not beaten them since October 2022, Dan, and they've lost 5 of the previous 8 meetings with only 3 draws in that time. History suggests that it will be a difficult afternoon for Manchester United, but then form would tell a different story. I know whenever big 6 sides per se go head to head, we speak about form going out the window, but I just can't help but feel that will not be the case on Saturday. Am I deluded, or are you coming along with me for that ride, Dan?
I mean, they didn't beat them 4 times last season, did they? Which is just quite incredible. They faced each other 4 times in 3 different competitions and didn't beat them once, including the Europa League final. The incredible thing is
bad.
when you think about the Europa League final and where both teams have gone, I mean, could you imagine where both teams are now? Manchester United in the top 4 going into the weekend, and Tottenham still languishing. Now, caveat is, of course, Tottenham do have a lot of injuries, and you have to make that kind of circumstance clear that, it's quite incredible they didn't invest more in January, really, to give Thomas Frank a bit more of a kind of squad depth. Of course, maybe a lot of those players will come back eventually. But, I don't know about you, Shaun. A lot of these games just feel like revenge games for this Manchester United squad. I mean, that's how... No, but honestly, that's what I thought, Fulham was. When I was hearing how the Fulham players talked after the draw earlier in the season, how Marco Silva, Calvin Bass, Alex Iwobi talked about how easy it was to play against United at Craven Cottage earlier in the season. I was thinking, that team talks easy for Michael Carrick. Go out and show what you're about. Now, Tottenham, as I mentioned, they didn't beat them earlier in the season. Now, that was probably more of a respectable point because of how United equalised in the last minutes. And, but again, as you mentioned, I mean, they haven't beat them. Like you lost the final against them last year. Put that right. That you're at Old Trafford, as you mentioned, with a kind of renewed atmosphere. I look at the next few games. West Ham was similar. In December, it was a horrendous game. So if I'm this United team, I'm looking at every game coming up. Everton is after that. Again, each of these games has their own narrative, but the Everton game at Old Trafford was one of the worst results performances we've seen over the last few years. So if I'm this United squad, I mean, Michael Carrick, Steve Holland, I think the team talks are relatively easy. Put these games right. Whether you win or not, at least get the performances right. And, put all of those kind of bad memories and bad kind of experiences behind you. And that's what I think this United team have to do. As you mentioned, Tottenham in the league have not found any consistency. I mean, their captain this week said essentially it was a disaster that they only had 11 fit players. and Christian Romero, I mean, you can tell probably morale isn't the best despite how they're playing in Europe. Whereas this is a United team, not to coin what Jay Borthroyd said just after the Manchester City went on Sky, but they're on the up. I think we could say that 3 wins now later. But you would expect kind of the atmosphere, the positivity, especially after Shesko scoring. I think that's the interesting, Sean, thing. The interesting thing is, what would you do against Tottenham? Do you bring in Sheshko and maybe give that team some renewed energy? Because I was at the game on the weekend. I mean, Ahmad looked quite shattered at different points in the game. His work rate was incredible, but I wonder if you shift Mbeumo to the right and bring in Sheshko just to give that team some new energy. He'll be full of confidence, or do you keep the same team again? Bear in mind, West Ham's a few days later.
I think you have a direct source to my brain because I was literally going to ask you about team selection as you were speaking. And I think it's going to be one of the most interesting talking points because Sesko, he provided such an impressive cameo. It wasn't just the goal, but his cameo was very good. And people forget, against Arsenal, his chest down with back to goal was absolutely integral in the build-up for Cunha to receive that and actually score. He provides that fantastic option in the final third as an out ball. And we know, obviously, with Spurs, they've got so many big physical guys. He is absolutely going to be in the consideration, especially what you said about Ahmad, because he runs and he gets about so much. From your perspective, do you think you would remain with the trio of Bruno, Cunha, and Mbeumo? Or would you like to see Carrick find a spot for Benjamin? Not necessarily solely on his individual cameos, because Ahmad has also been impressive, but more so to maintain a sense of high morale and unity with squad rotation.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think Carrick will have an idea about the West Ham game in a few days. And I think what Thomas Frank has shown, if this was an Ange Postecoglou team, I would say absolutely Mbeumo Ahmad start because they would be spacing behind a high line. Whereas Thomas Frank has shown he can be quite pragmatic. So I imagine they'll play slightly deeper because they're playing at Old Trafford. So I think in that sense, I would probably prefer Sheshko and his physicality, with the idea that against West Ham in a few days' time, under Nuno, who I've covered quite a lot, covering Nottingham Forest over the last few years, and what he's done at West Ham recently, I think with Sassy coming in as well, he will more likely play a 3 at the back, which, because of that, I'd much rather have Ahmad, Cunha, and Mbeumo leading that line to try and break down that 3. So that's probably what I would do, is Sheshko against Tottenham and Mbeumo back up front against West Ham. But I think the great thing is, Sean, is compared to Ruben Amorim and the system he was implementing, it's quite simple, I recognise, but when you had Ahmad starting at right wing back and Mbeumo ahead of him and Sheshko starting and Cunha as well, you didn't have anything on the bench. You did not have an attacking option off the bench unless Dalot started at right wing back. Whereas now you are guaranteed to have one of those brilliant attackers off the bench that can make an impact, and hopefully Mason Mount's back very soon, you would hope. So you have Mount plus one of those excellent 4 attackers, which, whoever starts, at least you have a viable option to change the game. How many games did we send to Ruben Amorim where you thought it's Zirkzee at best, who he is a great footballer, but he's not really an impact footballer off the bench, is what I would say, in no disrespectful way to him. So that is a big plus. And, I don't really have any qualms about team selection, but I think the Tottenham game, and as I mentioned, team talk should be relatively simple, I think, no matter who plays and who starts. And if it's about whether Mbeumo, who has scored all season, starts against the guy who just scored a winner on the weekend, it's for once a good selection dilemma to have, isn't it?
Yeah, that's for sure. And in terms of a team talk, Carrick was amongst many of those successful teams and many successful players. So it probably should just be as simple as, lads, it's Spurs, But all things said, while frustration and uncertainty remain a prevalent topic in the Northwest, I think we can all agree that winning is a very nice habit. And Carrick has found that knack rather quickly. If his side manages to continue in this manner at the weekend, who knows what way the table will look, because City play Liverpool, Villa make the difficult trip to Bournemouth. Anything is possible in football. you don't need me to tell you, United are 12 points behind Arsenal after 24
No, we're not
fixtures.
going here, Sean. Oh,
And on the chance that you are unaware, listener, it is 30 years since Fergie's Reds were 12 points behind Newcastle after 23 games played. So we all know how that finished. And dear God, can you imagine the scenes? But what I will say, it's been a pleasure to chat with you today, Dan. And I hope
thanks so
everybody listening enjoyed it as much as I did. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are listening today, wherever you're tuning in. Visit the website to keep up to date with all of our daily content at the Theatre of Red. Also, as I highlighted last week, YouTube has become a keen point for me, and I am hell-bent on growing that aspect, given how much I neglected it previously. We have a new video with Phil Brown out over there, so be sure to check that out too, and subscribe to be the first to know when we upload more. We'll be back next week and to chat about everything that occurs between now and then. So until we speak again, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your week.